Clabberton. Welcome to Conversing. Well, it's a great joy today to welcome Phil Chen as our guest on Conversing. Phil is a friend. Phil is a person who lives with his family in Taiwan, where they went just on the cusp of all of the madness that set into Hong Kong, where they had been living, and they then moved during the COVID period to Taiwan, which is where they are now. He has been a very serious technologist in a variety of ways and a technology investor. He has been a venture capitalist, and he's worked with companies that have been at the forefront of some of the technology that all of us use. In fact, I want to start right there. You had a hand in Siri, so tell us about that. That's something that almost everybody listening to this will have had some experience with. So tell us about Siri.
Yeah, so when I was in Hong Kong, I worked for a venture firm called Horizons. They had invested in Siri, but I had the opportunity to work with a man named Stephen Wolfram. He's one of the pioneers in the AI space, and he created this super powerful calculator called Wolfram Alpha, which is the engine behind Siri. When you ask Siri a technical question like, what's the distance between, Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it calculates that. And so that was it's called natural language processing. I had a chance to work with Stephen Wolfram, and I built a product in Taiwan around that. So yeah, that was my Siri connection.
Yeah, that's very fun. So tell us how you even got into this domain. I know that you went to the University of California, San Diego, and you majored in physics and in mathematics, I think. So tell us the migration from that to really entering into this technology world.
Well, when I graduated from Fuller, I started...
Let's pause there for just a second, because on your very first day, I think it was, when you had gotten a job, after you graduated, you went to JPL to work. And then later that day, I think it was, you were driving down the freeway, saw the sign for Fuller and thought, oh, right, I could also do an MDiv at Fuller. So let's just add that to your catalog of things. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Well, I interviewed at JPL, and I was driving down. When I saw seminary, even though I grew up in a Christian family, I did not know what a seminary was. And I went online to look it up, and I found these. It was during the summer. I found these 2-week intensive courses, and it's one of those moments in your lives where you hear the small, still voices, and it's one of the voices I heard. You just apply and go. It was that simple,
right?
And then that changed the course of me, my aspiring scientist part of me to theology. Yeah.
Yes, which you've continued to pursue.
Yeah.
So take us then beyond that. How did the technology window fully unfold professionally?
Well, I was working at a Korean church. It was a Korean immigrant church in Orange County. They were a very aggressive missionary organization. It was an immigrant church that, they've sent over 250 missionaries just from their home church.
Uh-huh.
And I was working with a missionary in the stands. So Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and I was working mostly in Tajikistan and Afghanistan.
Uh-huh.
And I helped him build schools for girls in Afghanistan in a place called Kunduz, which is the northeast of Afghanistan. And having grown up in Taiwan with tech background, I found this process very inefficient, building schools. And so then, long story short, there was a technology called e-ink, which was e-paper. And I started an organization called One Library per Child. I felt like I could build this device where if I handed this child this device, it would be able to replace or, become a whole library for themselves. For
and
education.
What year was that when you're thinking of these
that
things?
was 2003, 2004.
Right.
2004,
Great.
2005,
Go ahead.
2005. Yeah. Yeah. And, that company became the Barnes& and Noble ebook Nook. Yeah. And that was my foray into
Wow.
technology.
That's
Yeah.
quite a foray.
Yeah.
Good job. And then how did it progress? Because you've been both on the technology side and on the VC side. That's not an
Yeah.
uncommon combination, but talk about that.
Yeah. I think after that, I joined a company in Taiwan called HTC. HTC was also the first company to build the first Android devices with Google. And so from 2007 to 12, all I did was build Android phones. And the company did so well, I started, investing for the company.
Uh-huh.
And so my first investment in an AI company was a company called SoundHound. They're one of those companies that you could put up your phone to music, hear music, and identify a song.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah. And so that's a audio artificial intelligence technology.
Got it.
And so there were two companies that were leading in this space. One is called Shazam, maybe a lot of people heard of, and then SoundHound. And so that's how I started investing in AI companies.
Got it. So give us a picture from your point of view, having now been in this field for, approximately 20 years. What is the landscape that an average person needs to understand about how AI came into view? What have been the key developments and where are we now? How would you just sort of give a simple framing for that?
I would separate it into three big buckets in terms of what AI is. And the first bucket is what I just identified, which is the kind of the text to speech and speech to text. Like you can speak into a device and the AI would translate that into text, or it can go from text to read an audiobook.
Yes.
Or it can identify a piece of music. So it would be the audio side.
Yes.
Right. The AI would be able to identify sound into text.
Right.
The second big bucket is computer vision, right? And so all the conversation around autonomous driving, right? A car needs to be able to identify a road versus a human being. And so in my mid 2010s, we invested in a lot of computer vision companies. And there are a few companies we invested in, got acquired by a company called Niantic, which everybody will know is the company behind Pokemon Go. And computer vision is relevant there because, you would have to identify some landmark and then you place, the particular Pokemon there, and then your phone would be able to identify it and then you would be able to capture it, right?
Got
in
it.
that kind of real world game.
Yes.
And then the third big bucket is, I think, which most of the craze is today is these just large, it's natural language processing. It's these large language models where they're able to have very human conversations, right?
Yes.
So ChatGPT 4 is a large language model. And there are many of these large language models where you can have a full-blown conversation. It can summarize a book for you. You can input the whole Great Gatsby book, and you can ask it to write the epilogue of the book. And so, yeah, I would say those three modes are kind of the three big buckets. It's just vision, hearing, and text and language.
So as you're doing all this, you're also, I know, placing alongside it your own faith and theological reflections, which we'll come back to a little bit later, but that's all happening. So do you want to add that layer to your own perception of walking through this season of these three major chapters? What was happening for you as you were experiencing these things?
Yeah, I think for me, the unique perspective I bring to this industry really is having a theological background.
Yes.
And thinking more deeply on, and have a pretty good understanding on the technical and the product, but also having some understanding on scripture and human nature and the ethics behind it. And ethics is a huge topic right now, right?
Yes, yes.
And so, for example, in like one big issue, right? People think about today is the likes of Siri or your Amazon Alexa. It's this speaker sitting in your home, and it can listen to all your conversations throughout the day, right?
And is listening.
And is listening, yes. And so it can log all your conversation, and it's a huge invasion of intimate moments that you have with your family. And, what does that mean? And so one thing I often think about when investing in this space is economists call them externalities, right? What are the side effects of this technologies that's going to distribute to the whole population? And
Yes.
I think technologists don't think enough or talk about these externalities, right? Like we've experienced a lot of externalities in the industrial revolution where factories been scaling, but there hasn't been that much conversation on the externalities of technology. I mean, the simple things of, how these dating apps have completely changed human interactions and intimacy. Like that, I see that as something that hasn't been talked about enough or studied enough or really reflected enough.
Right.
Because this technology at the same time is changing so fast.
Yes.
And we can't even catch our breaths to really reflect and, is this actually helpful? Is this good or is this bad?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I remember years ago being really struck by the way that AI was already changing just the nature and experience of being human in so many different ways because of, yes, in one sense, just relying on what we might have benignly called a greater measure of technology. But actually, it was much more invasive and it was much more implicated in our perceptions because of algorithms, because of things that were being turned up for us to consider and evaluate or to read. How does all that begin to percolate with you as this progress is going on? Was it fearful? Was it exciting? I'm sure it was both, but I'm just curious, how did you reflect on it?
I was very fearful because I remember this was 2012. And
Yes.
I think this was the moment that kind of made me extra aware and fearful. And it was when we had this conversation with Facebook, and we were building the quote Facebook phone with them. And in a product meeting, we talked about like, what are the most delightful moments in social interaction that we want to emulate? And it was the idea of just randomly walking into an ice cream shop and bumping into an old friend. And that just, brought up a lot of, good memories and happy moments. And so we called the project Serendipity, right?
Uh-huh.
And so we as a product says, hey, how do we, through algorithms and now this thing on the phone that knows wherever you are, how do we make that happen more often?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So how do we manipulate the system in which you can have those experiences every day?
Right.
And
Right.
so the project was called Serendipity. And so, of course, if you think on another level, is like, if that happens every day or every other day, then is it still serendipitous?
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Right.
And so now you're playing the role of God, right? Of making these happenstance moments happen because you know the location, the most intimate conversation that's going on in
Yes.
typing in your phone.
Yes.
Every search, every, coffee you have bought, in the past 10 years, every product you've bought on Amazon, every book you've read, then it starts to get, okay, what role are we playing here, right?
Yes. Yes.
And is it still serendipitous if it can be generated? Basically?
Right.
And so that's when I became very uncomfortable. And that's when I almost basically stopped posting on Facebook.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I'm very much a passive observer in social media.
Yes.
I obviously, of course, admire the influence and the power people build on those platforms. But I keep them at, some distance.
Yes. Right. both for your own sake, but also because of principle, or is it really both, or is it mostly you yourself just not wanting to be implicated in the whole field?
It's just, well, having, been a part of this mobile phone that people are glued to, and how they're in the business of gluing your time and your eyeballs and your attention on these
Yes,
screens. And
yes,
I think that's the main reason why I would purposely basically fast, right, and stay away
yes,
from these
yes,
platforms, because it is very addictive. And a simple 10-second glance can turn into a 2-hour scroll or
right,
30, 40-minute scroll. And that is very normal, and right. And the data shows that people spend an average of 7 to 8 hours a day on their phones.
wow,
And that's average. And then you start to think, where is your attention, right?
yes,
And then, of course, you know, as a believer, you think about your attention is your worship, right? Where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. But where your treasure is where your heart. But your attention is how much heart and time and value you put on a particular thing, right?
right, right.
And so, yeah, it came down to how much attention you want to put into these platforms.
I was struck by the role when you were giving us the three buckets. One of the things that you mentioned was related, I think, ultimately to AR, and I'm curious how that figured into your understanding of these things. I want to come eventually to talk about Apple's newest device, but just as that was unfolding, that was taking us yet again into a new domain.
Yeah, well, AR meaning augmented reality, right? I think the game that everybody was most familiar is Pokemon Go, that really kind of
Yes,
introduced this game. And it's an amazing blend of digital content onto the real world. And that remains to be exciting. And that remains, I would say, it still sounds like a healthier goal than completely kind of locked into your room. I remember there was a pitch that Pokemon Go, and it was so far-fetched that it was also made it interesting, because they saw themselves as a health company, because they would say, we are making people go outside and walking, right?
right.
Because people are
It's an exercise
taking
program.
That's right. It's an exercise program. And that was their spin to their positive contribution to humanity, right?
Yes,
Through an
yes.
exercise program. And although, the results were people did walk more for this, it is quite a spin to say that, right?
Yes, yes.
But nevertheless, it was an interesting experiment. And so, yeah, I would say there are many companies that I invested in this space that are applying that technology to be able to identify very accurately where you are on a map.
Yes,
And when you can do that, you can imagine the world becomes your playground.
yes,
And you
yes.
can build very interesting games around, location-based real-world games.
I was amused recently to be walking on the campus of Caltech in Pasadena, and it was a weekend, and there were, I would guess, maybe 75 or 100 people, all adults, in the middle of the day, walking around the campus playing that game. And there it was, right? You're in the center of one of the great universities, technologically oriented universities, science oriented universities. And right in the middle of it, this game is being played. And people were both together, as you know, together, but also quite isolated from each other. They were all looking at their phones, standing in close proximity. Very little actual conversation, I felt, was unfolding. But I suppose they were, quote, exercising, in that they were standing up. There wasn't a whole lot of walking going on because they were all focused on something they were hoping would happen.
Yeah, there was I think a Harvard professor who wrote this book called Alone Together.
Yes, yes,
And I think it's describing this phenomenon you're referring to.
yes, yes. It's quite amazing. So as you think about that part of technology, let's just jump that forward to Apple's newest announcement about its headset. And what's similar, different? Just sort of walk us through that so that people who, again, may have read some things but don't necessarily use these tools would be able to understand.
Well, I think Apple's tool right now is still enhancing the couch potato experience.
I see. Got it. Yeah.
Right. It's not really a
no
product
exercise program.
Well, they could be, but it would be still in the confines of your living room.
Yes.
Right. And so it would still be considered virtual reality rather than,
Yes.
well, it does have mixed reality, but yeah, it's not really a product ready for you to wear as you're walking down the street.
Yes.
It's still primarily a home device or on a couch device.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Do you think it is intriguing to you? Do you think it will get broad adoption, or how do you think that'll be received?
I do think it will. I think from what I've read and what I've seen, it will change that living room experience you have, that relationship you have with your TV, so to speak.
And your couch.
And your couch. That's right. And so you have a more intimate relationship with your couch, and then you'll find a new girlfriend, and instead of your TV, it's your Vision Pro. So in that sense, it will change.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to Conversing. One of the things that you've written about has been really some pretty substantial reflection around the area of these externalities, namely some of the ethical and moral and social and human dimensions of how AI is played out. And one of those has been some reflection that you've been doing around the Tower of Babel. Take us to that biblical text and then take us to your reflections of where that's led you to think about and how to think about AI.
Yeah, I think the key kind of concept is around a monolithic language, right? Is one language to rule them all. Right?
Yes.
And I think that would be the dream of these AI companies. And that was also, one of the main things in the Tower of Babel is how do we unite everybody into this one monolithic kind of language.
Yes.
And many of the companies today, from Google to Microsoft to OpenAI, that is their goal. The goal is to build a centralized large language model that can rule them all, right? And so I saw that parallel. And of course, there's another movement around open source models. Companies like Mosaic or Stability or Hugging Face. These are companies that, see that, no, this world there should be many language models and many verticals, and every country should have the sovereignty and the power to decide which model they want to use and how to build in their own biases, right? And be very transparent about it.
Yes.
And so the open source part is really important because you need to have these open conversations, and you build out in the open. You make mistakes out in the open, but you're also very transparent about the biases and the specific applications. Because if you're a closed source, and I think the most notable company is a company called OpenAI, and the irony is they're closed source, right?
Right.
And they're the company that first shipped ChatGPT and became, doing very well. And then they closed source their system and all for security and safety reasons, right?
Right. And fearing that it was going to run out of control. Isn't that right?
Yes. And they're also the ones that are now saying it should be regulated. But there's another movement around open source where no, we're building smaller models, more efficient models, and more contextualized and nuanced models.
Yes.
I think what I was trying to express there was that I think scripture supports more on, the diversity of voices and languages and perspectives. I'm reminding in the book of Revelation where all the kings come and present their gifts,
Yes.
right, from all the different lands. And yeah, I do think that is a vision that is more consistent with scripture and in a fight against tyranny, right?
Right. And more
And
consistent with the human experience around the
that's
world.
right.
It's not a capitalistic vision in the sense of one entity, one company, one controlling force.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more consistent with a healthy, robust, flourishing human, cultural
Yes.
system.
And
Yeah.
an ecological system as well. Yeah. Yeah. So when you talk about the multiplicity of large language systems that are being built and so forth, and the prejudice that is intentionally being put into them in different ways, how do we even know what those intentions are? If I'm mistaken, correct me, but my understanding is that those are largely really invisible to us, just really unseen. We don't understand or know what those things are. Is that true, or is that overstating it?
What's interesting right now is, this touches on the idea of freedom of speech, right?
Yes, right.
Which is a huge conversation in the world of politics right now.
Yes.
And I would say that almost all the ChatGPT-like language models it's very much filtered, right? You can't say this. You can't allow a computer to say this or that, right? And it does lean more on the woke side,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the debate is, does freedom of speech apply to machines?
Yes.
Right.
Right. Right.
And the fact of the matter is right now it doesn't, because they are also being filtered, right?
Right. Right.
Like Microsoft releasing their search engine can't afford Bing to say this, right?
Right.
As an answer to a question about, I don't know, a gender question, right?
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, and then of course it becomes the question of whose speech are we talking about, right?
Yes. Right. Right.
And in which community, right?
Yes.
These are questions not being asked. It's just assumed that it can't say this because it's aligned with this particular value, right? A lot of these language models are trained on, very interesting data sets. So I think you're familiar with Twitter,
Yes.
right?
Sure.
With Reddit
Yes.
and, Quora.
Yes.
And these are all data sets, and it's very interesting data sets because it's very categorized, right? The conversations are about, you can label it about, certain topics. But then I don't think anybody would say Twitter or Quora or Reddit is, balanced and objective, right? It
Right.
does have its subjectivity
Quite.
and bias, right?
Yes. Right.
And so that it's in itself is, data that it's training on is already subjective.
Yeah.
And then added on to whatever ethics or values or the engineer can prevent it or filter out what it can and cannot say.
Right.
Right. I think these are all open questions that are not being discussed openly.
Right.
In many of these models.
Which is, in fact, the way that language develops culturally, right? Culture has been the name, not AI, as the holder of prejudices, which are shaped in any given place around the world and which have built into them the assumptions of a particular class, ethnicity, race, gender, et cetera, right? Those are also largely not examined, which is part of what is going on in this era that we're all living through, where a lot of those things are being second guessed and reconsidered and thought to be potentially on one side woke, on the other side to be PC. In that tension lies where a lot of the cultural debates around language and free speech and the particular words that we use is just coming to the fore with such ferocity in so many different ways right now. So what's interesting is that the crisis of AI that you're describing, which is absolutely what I'm understanding and you're verifying, is actually the way that we have operated as people. It's just that now you would think that we have the opportunity to do it in a less prejudicial way. And then to not be yet choosing to do it in that way is a problem.
Yeah, well, exactly. Which is why I think open sourcing these models are of critical importance, because now every community can take a model and basically train it for its own values and its own biases.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But having it open and transparent is important to identify, no, this does have its biases. There's no such thing as a non-biased objective language model, because language has built-in biases.
Right. Exactly.
But I would say the more scientific, the people building these things have this naive ethical view that there is such thing as an objective computer-based decision. And I think that might be the part that is more frightening.
Right.
And often these are the companies that hold that power to make these decisions.
It's the homogenization of capitalism.
That's right.
Right. I mean, not that it has to be homogenizing, but often it has been homogenizing. So I know that it's in part in this area that we run into these debates that go on about whether AI is going to become God and take over the world and take over all of our lives. And you've also written about that and some other models or frames by which we might understand it. One is the tyrannous one, where AI is the tyrannous godlike force that could control us. But you've written and proposed a very different frame, which I'd like us to explore. So tell us a little bit about how you've thought about these things.
Well, I would just say there's been a lot of conversation on, is AI becoming sentient and becoming, of course, more intelligent and smarter than human beings. A lot of sci-fi, movies, have been published and films being made that appeal to our fear. And there's this sense of which our humanity, we have this existential threat of our humanity from these AIs.
Yes. Right.
And so I would just say, I think what we talked about before are, I think, the practical concerns. And I think there are the real concerns about AI, which is the concentration of power, right? And then the biases that are built in these algorithms.
Yes.
I think those are the real problems, practical problems.
Yes.
But then when you zoom out on kind of the existential kind of fear around this, and then the fear that's been, around from, Hollywood storytellers, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And to, even a lot of experts that say it's the end of the world, more apocalyptic visions of these AI. And in that framework, I kind of had this, maybe call it theological fiction, this idea of behind Freud and Girard.
Yes.
Where Freud, do we see this AI as, this father that's more powerful than us that we need to destroy? Or is it more about, a Girardian in the kind of sibling rivalry space?
Do we see Girard, AI, the philosopher, right? Mm-hmm.
Do we see AI as a rival?
Yes.
Right. To our human intelligence. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so it was more of, I guess, a creative imagination kind of thought about it. And it makes a difference of how we think about
Absolutely.
AI. Is it this judgmental father that we're trying to annihilate? Or do we see it as a peer rival that we're building it in our own image, right?
Right.
It's mimetic in that sense. It's mimetic.
Yes.
It's copying what we do as human
Yes.
beings, the way we talk. And so, yeah, I just started to think about how we frame the way we think about these AGIs and pointing out the anxieties around how this can replace, is this a better human being?
Yes. Yes.
Right. And of course, there's in the technology world, right, there's a conversation about we can build better human beings, right? Anything from genetic
Yes.
modification to, building better intelligences.
Mm-hmm.
But it does question the foundational insecurity we have as a human being and our flaws is, it comes down to, do we think we're good enough, right?
Yes, right.
Are we the creatures that God created? Are we good enough? When God said this is good, is it good enough? Is it the best? Or artificially, can we make ourselves better? Can we play the role of God again? It comes down to this question of what role are we playing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of what I was kind of starting to talk about and think about.
Well, I think it's such an intriguing idea. So the first model is God potentially, that is AI, is seen as a father that we somehow have to defeat in order to find our own strength and assure our own survival. In the second one, you're saying it's an opportunity for human beings to grow as a result of the competitive advantage that AI has that could call forth from us a better kind of humanity. Then the third one that comes to mind that obviously many people have suggested is that it's a tool and that it's just an extension of our humanity. But going back to one thing that I think is important for us to touch on before we're done is this question that no one really understands how AI is making decisions. So the idea of thinking of AI as just a tool that extends our capacities in exceptional ways is fine analogously. However, AI has this capacity to make decisions which no one really understands. So talk to us about that, because I think it's that space that people don't necessarily know how to name or even talk about that I think you could help bring greater clarity to.
Yeah, there needs to be a balance between explainability and accuracy.
Yes.
And so, for example, in a medical space, right, when an AI decides or diagnoses that you have a certain type of cancer, right, it has huge implications on not just treatment, but insurance. It has huge implications. And when you can't explain how it came to make that decision, right, then that affects everything again, from treatment to diagnostic to insurance,
yes,
right?
Right.
And different countries have taken different approaches, right? So China, for example, has chosen, and right now these systems, because of these neural nets, they're so large and so huge, and the parameters are so, astronomical, that we don't know how they make decisions. We can't explain how they came to make a decision, but we know it's very accurate,
Yes.
right? And so there's this, there's this trade-off you have to take often, where you can choose the system to be extremely accurate, 99% accurate, but you can't explain it. Or you can be less accurate, like down to maybe 80% accurate, but you're able to explain these models. And so, for example, the Chinese, mainland China, they have decided they want accuracy over explainability. They're more, I guess, utilitarian in that sense, right?
Yes, right.
I want to be able to diagnose correctly more so than being able to explain. Whereas Europe, obviously because of its history, they've chosen, no, we need these models to be more explainable.
Right.
Right. And so when we make mistakes, we can have open discussion, and we can trace back where the problem came from,
Yes. Yes.
right? And so there is this conundrum in the AI space right now where you have to take these trade-offs often. And when it comes to just chatting about, nonfiction writing or an entertaining conversation, it doesn't matter. But when it's about your health or when it decides on a legal case,
Yes.
right? Then it really has material consequences.
Yeah. Yeah.
That you need explainability, right? And so, yeah, I think that's one very practical problem that we're up with. These models can be so powerful, so accurate, and so quick, but then it can get out of hand if it's completely not explainable to a human being, right? And so that is one of the big conundrums right now in this space.
So I know that we've been talking about the need for open AI, but if Phil Chen was king of the universe and could establish that balance between accuracy and explainability, where would you put the priority?
I would say in the cases that have material consequences, such as legal and medical, for example, then explainability is more important, right?
Yes. Yes.
But if it's just, if you're, I don't know, playing the game of Go, right, or some game, then explainability is where it's not that important. And so I think I would adjudicate between what has material consequences to people's lives and what doesn't.
Yes.
Right. And so, yeah, I would pick and choose, really. And I think if we went in the open source models where you have smaller models and specific applications, I think there is an opportunity for different applications, different contexts,
Yes.
to choose between accuracy and explainability.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is interesting how much the word consequences is measured differently by cultural values, moral values, theological perspectives, et cetera, right? Those all feed into this. And what we're prepared to think is appropriate and what is overreaching or what is blind, even if accurate, right? It's just a very, very interesting and important discussion. I do think that as we finish, that one of the things that I wanted to have you just reflect on a bit more is, does this, the sum of what we're talking about and your own direct engagement in supporting and investing in various enterprises that are doing things, how do the values that you're trying to bring to this work that you're doing, both as a developer and as an investor, how does that get informed by your faith, and what both gifts and challenges does that create for you?
I think the biggest challenge is because in the tech world, and especially in Silicon Valley, I would say the value and the ethics is quite homogenous.
Yes.
Right. And I would say, the values enforced that I was informed of and brought up is, I'm a huge minority, and that's an understatement.
Yes, right. As a Christian, you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
And so that minority, that voice is very much silent in this space. And so, for example, in this conversation, there's a big conversation around, are these AIs aligned with human goals?
Yes.
Right. And so, Elon Musk would ask this question, Mark Zuckerberg would ask these questions. But the fascinating thing is what they call human goals is the homogenous, right, ethic and value that, Silicon Valley abides to.
Yes, yes.
But nobody actually stops and questions, like, whose values are we talking about? Whose goals and which community, right?
Yes.
Which, of course, then makes me ask the question, and this is what I learned at Fuller, taking Nancy Murphy's class on Alistair McIntyre, right? He wrote this book on whose justice, which rationality.
Yes.
Right. And that is I think a fundamental question not being asked right now is whose values, which rationality, and whose justice right, are we talking about when we're talking about alignment?
Right.
Right. And so it's a fundamentally ethical question. It's a fundamentally human question.
Yes.
Not being asked. And because the tech world is so homogenous on this,
Yes.
that it's large. It's a voice that's silent.
Yes. Yeah. And does it seem silenced?
Yes, I do think so. Because, and this goes back to the concentration of power, right?
Yes.
In these companies, from whether it's Amazon, Google, or Facebook, they're all aligned on this human goal.
This
and so
homogenization.
And they control the highways of this information, right?
Right.
They can choose what to filter out and what not to, and what to push in front of a Google search, for example, right? Or what's being surfaced on your Facebook feed. And so, yes, it is very much silenced, right? But, do we have a chance to be that voice in the wilderness, right? To speak. That's my prayer.
Right. Yeah.
In this industry.
Thank you so much, Phil. This has been a great conversation, and I'm sure I will be coming back to you with more of it at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they're released. And please leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.